apologize if you are in a very inconvenient time zone, but I guess this is what the webinar is all about. So thank you very much for your time and your effort, and also your support and guidance. As I've mentioned earlier, after Barcelona, we thought we want to do a kind of a post-mortem before we forget what are the main impacts and what are the main achievements we've got from Barcelona. So the best way to do it, to listen to colleagues from other parts of the world and give some feedback of what is it that we are doing right and what is it that we can do better. I think the momentum in university is such that everybody is quite excited to follow through. But before we go into something that we think it is important, we would like to get some feedback. And I think, thank you very much, Professor Charles Hopkins, Professor Impi Meko, and also Dr. Francis Pedro. And I would like to particularly emphasize Pedro in the context of Dr. Emma. Emma, I think, has been instrumental in bringing us into the main fold and the mainstream of discussion, maybe about a year ago, when we start discussing what is it that we are doing. And now I think we are part and parcel of the platform, as it were. So I will not take much time because we want to listen more to you. But let me reiterate, I would like to thank you from the bottom of heart and also from our institution. And the institution, I think, is geared to putting things into practice. I've mentioned a little bit of what we have done in Barcelona. And I think we are now trying to rewrite some of this to realign with some of the findings, the major findings at least, in the various deliberation. We have got webinars and particularly the Barcelona thing, and also try to predict what will happen in 2023 when I'm told that there is a kind of a final summit. So this discussion is very much to gear ourselves into the proper perspective of what we need to do for the futures of education. I'd like to thank everybody once again, and also my colleague for taking this on. A number of them is listening in. We will have our own discussion, and later on we will contact you as to what is the decision of moving forward, and maybe we can have more discussion on that note. So I will stop there, and I'll thank everybody for participating, and I'll pass it back to Zainal to moderate the session. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Tan Sri. Thank you very much, everyone. And on the organizing side, we really would like to thank all the three speakers. It was a very short notice, especially Pedro. Emma said that she cannot make it, but suddenly last 2 days we got a very email that the boss is coming. So we're so happy for that. So with that remarks, I guess let's start to listen some wisdoms and sharing from Prof. Charles. You've got the floor, Profs.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think it's really important that we continue this discussion around Barcelona. Let me put up my screen. I've prepared a few slides just to kick things off. And of course, being totally honest, Catherine actually prepared the slides. But at any rate, here we go. I think the idea of the Barcelona, the World Higher Education Conference, the product that came out of it in the way of a roadmap is a living thing. And so it's important that we take advantage of that. You know, these World Higher Education Conferences only take place every 12 to 15 years or so, and they usually come at an important sort of crossroads in time. Now, of course, with trying to get out of the pandemic and surrounded by issues like climate change and the social injustice issues around the world, the biodiversity loss and so on. I think it's important for higher education to stop and just think about what is its role and to reimagine it. And so being there, the idea of the World Higher Education Conference, I like to think of it sort of in parallel with the Sustainable Development Goals, which greatly influence the conference. But the idea of we have global goals, but then how do we bring this down into local implementation in locally relevant, culturally appropriate ways? And so I think these kinds of discussions are really important. The roadmap that came out, I think, as you said, the timeline is shifting. Although the whole conference was in a context of the SDGs, even the SDG colors sort of influenced all of the, not necessarily the decorations, but everywhere you looked, it seemed to be there. And as I say, this living document that came out was influenced by a number of other documents that were being discussed. But I think at the heart of the overarching feeling of the conference, it was about sustainability. It was also about a call for transformation. And I think that what we really need is some sort of clarity around this transformation. And what UNESCO did was provide 6 areas that are suggested as a need for transformation. The first being access, greater access, and so on, so that the university itself not be seen as sort of an elitist thing just for a few, but really something that is of great influence to the community and so on. They were asking us to transform or think about a holistic student learning as opposed to more silo approach. But how do we develop the whole person and so on? They wanted to look at diverse perspectives. They're asking, whose knowledge, whose research, what do we accept as truth? And what dominates what gets taught, and so on. So these were 6 areas that that UNESCO put forward, and the idea that this was to start a discussion that would go on through to 2032, 2033 in that area, as do we bring about the major changes that are needed. Now, the roadmap, I found it really interesting. The roadmap was informed by several documents, and one that I found really very, very interesting was this one that was brought forward by 14 higher education experts who had worked for some time. I refer to it as the Bergen document, but really knowledge-driven actions. And again, the concept of transforming higher education for that purpose of sustainability. The document itself mentioned values and ethics, which I think are an extremely important part. And it too really questions that: what are the source of knowledge? What are the ways of knowing? And bringing that into it, and the idea of sustainability as a purpose of education, which is yet another interpretation, one that I've been trying to move forward for a very long time, moving it away from the idea of a discipline or a particular area. Now, the other document that was brought forward that was to inform the roadmap coming forward is this one that Goonie sort of shared right at the end. But again, the focus on transformation and a focus on sustainability and their contribution to it. The idea of humanism and was infused in it. The idea of global citizens, internationalization of being very important, and it was. I found that it was different in that the last one, it called for governance professionals. So it wasn't limited to the academics to be thinking and talking about it in that way. The other document that greatly informs our discussion over these next 7 or 8 years, of course, is the document on the futures of education. This is an important one, you know, that sort of building on Delors, focus on, you know, on becoming. But the part that is so important from this that wasn't really in the roadmap yet that I could see, is the roadmap seemed to still be focusing on the holistic individual, you know, enriching the whole individual. But at the heart of this is the idea of higher education as a social contract, where higher education serves society as well as developing, you know, a wonderful holistic human being. So that is another important element that I think we have to take forward as we go forward. How do we blend these? Now, at the same time, but wasn't mentioned there at Barcelona, but this is the 50th anniversary of Stockholm, you know, from 1972. And what, in delving into this, because I really, this was sort of, many claim the birthplace of sustainability. It really is the birthplace of environmentalism. But of course, that's at the heart of sustainability. But what I found interesting is that if you look at the recommendations and look into the outcomes of Stockholm, higher education isn't mentioned. So it gives sort of an insight for us as to how we're perceived by the UN family and the sort of the ministries of environment and so on. We may be an instrument and a tool there, but we are still not seen at the core. Unlike 1972, it was Stockholm that gave birth to environmental education, calling on Unesco and UNEP to try and invent this environmental education and launch the International Environmental Education Program. This time, education it really was not mentioned. Now, as well, if I think back of these documents, at the heart of it is sustainability, which I think all of us are really concerned about. At the heart of it are the Sustainable Development Goals, which we will have we're halfway through the decade. And part of our discussion is, as Zul was saying, where do we go from here? What should we be adding? I think this is sort of an underlying context not necessarily the Sustainable Development Goals. They're there at the moment, but will be replaced by the next iteration of a global agenda as they come to an end in 2030. What is the role of higher education in being a more important part of where we go in the future and how we can address it? Still, the United Nations sees education for sustainable development, not just education, but it's interesting, the wording, education for sustainable development is not only an integral part of quality education, but they see it as the key enabler of all the sustainable development goals. And so the swirl and the arrows that we put into this sort of represent the idea of embedding education for sustainable development as that purpose. So in wrapping up, I think what we need to, in our discussions, is that we should fall back on these different documents that are brought forward. The green being education for sustainable development, the program on ESD. And then we have the imagining our futures, the futures of education, that social contract, the idea of how can higher education serve the individual, but how can it collectively be part of society? And then the Guni document and the Bergen document and so on. How can we then look at, in the center, we have the 9 particular sustainable development goals that the United Nations has identified as where higher education should play a role, whether it's research or implementation and so on in the particular one. But on the right, how do we localize this into a context that is relevant and where our communities wish to engage, and where it's culturally appropriate and so on. And so, Zul, at some point, you may want to talk a little bit about the Iium roadmap as to how you take all of this and try to blend it. Because this whole idea of transformation requires a great deal of discussion. When we look into it, I think that much of what we say we need to transform to has been in our hearts to begin with. We just probably have not done that great a job. Do we use the name transforming? I don't think that most university professors themselves want to be transformed. They like to transform others, but how are we going to shape this discussion as leaders? How do we bring about this definitely the needed changes? And so the bottom line will be, do we transform, or are we transformed? Or do we become a major part of transforming society to meet the great challenges that are not only here now, but the ones that we can see on the horizon? So with that, I'll close, and if you wish, I can stay for a little bit and maybe take a question or two, but I hope that that helps in that recap, just to share my thoughts of what we need to do.
Thank you, Charles. The questions that you put really making us sleepless, but whether, yeah, as university people say that we like to transform others, but not ourselves. But there's a big question that we need to pick up here. Any response Prof. Faris, anything, anyone online, because Prof. Charles have to leave to prepare for another meeting and take a break for a while before waking up for the real meeting tomorrow, next morning and this morning. Anyone, any additions, or we proceed first and then we'll come back to any question that may come after that. Thank you so much, Charles, for the contributions that give ideas to those who were not in Barcelona, and at least we now know what is the roadmap about and the other documents that may be relevant that we will use as a reference later on. Thank you very much, Charles.
You're most welcome. And again, this I hope to remain as part of this discussion over the coming months and years. I think it's really important to consider this and to try and figure out how we change and what we are able to change into and so on. There's so much that we need to learn within our own vocabulary, how we approach our own institutions, our fellow colleagues and so on, and what we how we relate to our communities, the people we serve, and then how higher education as an entity itself, its discussion with its governments and on the international scene. So
just a quick one, Charles, that since you if you were to have this magic wand to ensure this continuity of things to happen, actions to happen after the conference, because we know conference happen every month, it will dilute and then come another conference, momentum building up again and then diluting again. So if you have something that you would do to ensure that there is an actions that follows from this, what would that be?
I think to make sure that we engage with the roadmap, and we figure out something within by the end of this year, that we have a collective from a number of not only universities but institutions, you know, just like the core that we have here today, that somehow we engage and send something in, something meaningful, and try to tie a lot of the individual things that we all do every day. You know, the RCE meeting that's coming up, a part of that could talk about how higher education is translating into local engagement, local activities, the whole questioning of whose knowledge. These kinds of things, I think we can cast them in a light of informing UNESCO and informing the roadmap. That brings some kind of unity of individual actions. It brings it into some kind of cohesion where the entity is bigger than simply the sum of the parts.
Yeah.
That's my first thought at 2:30 in the morning.
One question before you go. It just strikes me. I think it's quite. We can see how to work with the community. My question now: how do you work with the primary and the secondary school? I mean, we talk about higher education. The word higher somehow rather becomes almost a barrier. You know, that people in the lowest schools do not see it as part and parcel of the alignment that they want to make. How do you connect? You work with the schools a lot. How do you connect with them in terms of getting this, what do you call, a big picture of transformation rather than the silo between higher education and whatever else we've got? How do you approach that?
this afternoon, or yeah, well, no, yeah, yesterday afternoon at our campus, we had 500 high school students from the local community, the part around the university itself, were marched onto campus in a great welcoming thing. For the last 2 years, those high school students have been, we found ways of engaging and bringing them in. But I think it is a strategy that we really do have to work on. The idea of opening up our institutions to the community, and particularly the community where the students wouldn't normally be coming from. What we need to reach out and serve in that way. Now, of course, when we look into the issues of equity, we have to start thinking what are the barriers, and we can't just do the equal. We have to do equity. We have to prioritize and reach out and get them, but we also have to look at, why are they not coming? Is it part of a program? Is it just the way we behave and act? Are we relevant to them? All of these kinds of fundamental questions that universities have a very difficult time in holding. When you have 4,000 or 5,000 faculty, it's hard to hold a faculty meeting. How do you even launch these kinds of discussions in the context of universities and colleges and so on? Anyway, sorry, it's a long answer, but it's a core question that we have to ask.
Prof. Charles, now you are stuck here. People start asking you. Prof. Faris have one more question.
Okay, Prof. Charles, Faris here. Good to listen from you again. I guess follow-up question or discussion to this is the framework look quite solid and quite comprehensive. But then, like your last point is about the obstacles and challenges. There are other movements also. I mean, we are bringing people towards sustainability, but we also have the contra culture. So I think, how can we take care of this balance? So that at the end of the day, the sustainability culture become the dominant culture. Thanks.
Yeah, that'll be the huge challenge. That when I began, I think I was saying, just like the Sustainable Development Goals, how do we take these global goals, which has a feeling of unity all around the world, and how do we translate them locally? Each institution, we have 6 universities and colleges, huge colleges here in Toronto. Each one of them has to have its own approach. It has its own image. It's what they stand for. And what the roadmap is calling for is an integration of these different things, so that no one does everything, but together they serve the community. And maybe that's sort of a metaphor of what are the real needs within IIUM or any other institution. What are the needs of the community? What are the needs and capability of the university? And then how do you go forth and get the resources so that you can do the equity and address the need for funding and the need for resources, so that our most vulnerable who are capable of attending university can do it. What can we learn from what we've tried to do online? How can we reach out into the more remote communities? the work that you're doing with Sagittarius and the work in the indigenous communities, you know, it doesn't, we have to rethink. It doesn't mean that they have to leave those communities and come to Kuala Lumpur. It may mean that they come and experience bits of time there, but how do you serve them in a meaningful way, not just through the internet, but through technology-enabled elders in the community? How do you co-build a relevant knowledge that is more elegant and not the same as what's delivered on campus, but a form of higher education for that community to help and lift them out of poverty, but at the same time maintain who they are? And how can we learn back from them? Underlying it all, we have to remember that we ourselves must transform, society must transform. We all need to. And how are we going to listen to other voices in doing that? And how then are we going to engage the social sciences to bring about that kind of transformation? So we have a lot on our plate, and unfortunately, not a long time to just philosophize about it, but we do need to engage in this in a meaningful and purposeful way.
Thank you, Charles. Good night. Otherwise, we'll be glued here. We surely have Catherine, our PhD students there to answer on behalf. All right. Thank you very much, Charles. Yeah. Good night.
Right. Good night. Good day.
We would like to call next Professor Mempine. I'm not sure. I hope you can help us to pronounce this correctly, Prof. Who is the Commonwealth of Learning Chair in Open Educations, and he's also the Acting Dean of College of Education, University of South Africa, Pretoria. Now, when we left with Professor Mempine and Pedro, is sort of like a replay of what is the sessions that was in Barcelona, where Pedro was the moderator, and these two persons are the resource person. So we may continue that discussions here. The floor is yours, Prof.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. My name is Mpine Makwe. It's a silent M. It means sing for me. So I'm not going to be singing for you today, but we will be talking about the roadmap. What does the roadmap mean following Barcelona? And thank you so much, Professor Zul, for setting up the scene for us and to discuss this while it's still fresh in our minds. And I really appreciated Professor Charles for the recap that he did in terms of what is it that we need to move forward to. I'm going to try and share my slides. Okay, yeah, here we go. Let me do it as a slideshow somewhere. From beginning, okay. I was asked to speak for 15 minutes, which is a very big ask for someone who gets paid for talking. But we will try and see how best we can do it in that format. I think Barcelona was important in several ways, and I think the most important part was to bring us together to start reinventing higher education for sustainable ideas and practices for the future. That allows us to enhance that particular process. That allows us as higher education people to engage and debate about higher education. And because if we don't do that, Other people, the military will decide for us. The industry, the economic people, all these people will decide. The politicians, worst of all, the politicians will decide on the future or you even decide what we need to do. And I think part of the problem is that because we are so much engaged in what we are doing in the present, we forget to think that our role is to prepare for the future. And our role is also to start thinking about the future in a systematic way. Future thinking really is not about the strategy or about plans, but it's about visioning, having certain images that you can aspire for, the certain images that will help us to move forward in terms of what we think we are doing. UNESCO has been engaged in this. UNESCO ISALC in particular has been engaged in this process for some time, and that's how we got engaged. That's how I was invited by Emma to contribute to the futures of higher education and visions, and also in other places that we did. And I was engaged with UNESCO as an expert in higher education, looking specifically at the futures of higher education. So my role was to say, well, there's a lot to think about the futures of higher education, but I needed to come up with just one aspect of it. And I thought maybe it's important for us to think about the methodology, because if we say something is systematic, there is a method that goes with it. So there are a lot of documents that have been produced. The Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract, pathways towards 2050 and beyond. And all this, we're doing it in thinking about 2050 and beyond. Now, it is important for us to think about the future or even the 2050 and beyond, because we cannot change the future if we do not reflect on the dominant images that we have. It's important for us to think about that, because there are a lot of dominant images within the higher education sector that we need to question, that we need to get rid of. Others we need to strengthen, others we need to divert it a little bit. But whatever that we do, we need really to think about that. And the roadmap, actually, it showed us those things that Charles alluded to that I'm not going to talk about, issues of equitable access, issues of lifelong learning, issues of holistic students. And I know that Professor Zul always speaks about humanizing education system. And I believe so, that we need to humanize education system in order to bring the values of who we are in the education system. We should see our values in the education system rather than focusing mainly on disciplines and forgetting about who we are. And maybe it's also my concern that now that technology has come in and taken over, the focus now is on technology. It's not on the human beings. And it's important for us to remind ourselves that values are ingrained in human beings. They are not in those things that are there, the shiny stuff that are there to assist us. Now, UNESCO has a vision of higher education. And I think all of us has a vision of what we plan to do. Education in nature is about images of the future. When you start, maybe when you start grade R, or your parents take you to your first day in class, they have their own vision of what they want you as an educated person. But as you grow older, you also have your own visions of what you want to achieve from education. And these visions are the things that pulls you towards what you aspire for. So it's important for us really to start visualizing a different kind of higher education. So UNESCO says that education is a right, and they have said that in many documents, and it needs to be exerted along the whole life cycle. It's a provision in an activity aimed at favoring equity and equal distribution of opportunities. And these are some of the things that we need to question. Are we achieving this? Are we equitable? Is there equal distribution of opportunities when we provide higher education? And there are certain standard missions of higher education about producing knowledge, educating people, and serving communities. Those three legs, I have put a picture of an African iron pot. This pot can withstand fire, it can withstand storms, it can withstand anything. It's a very strong a pot made out of iron, and it stands on three legs. And every leg has an important component to it. What we have in education now, one leg has been given prominence over the others. And that's why we find ourselves lopsided as an education system. If we want to achieve what we want to do, we need to be social responsible in terms of producing knowledge, humanizing knowledge, in terms of educating people, also in terms of serving the community. So my contribution, my humble contribution in this process is to start the discussions on the futures of higher education and recommend actions towards the visioning process. And the visioning process, it offers really a methodology that could be used or adapted to design and develop different types of scenarios or images or anything that we want to design for the future we aspire for. So why are we engaging in the visioning process? We engage in this process because we want to question who we are, the assumptions about what higher education should be. We need to focus on the potential changes that are likely to happen in our spaces. We need to empower ourselves to create and shape the future we aspire for, because unless we have those images, we will not be able to move from where we are. Because right now, the current is not as interesting and as good. And also we are looking at the current in terms of the challenges. We are not looking at it in terms of the hopes and the aspirations that we have. So it's important for us as well, as we do in the visioning, to reflect on where we are coming from. But as we are reflecting, it's also critical to shape. When you reflect and you look where you're coming from, you are able to shape the future that you want. And also the visioning process also offers us tools to envision the images of what we would like the higher education to look like, and forces us to live with a different awareness of time. And this is based on the theme of the conference of Reinventing Higher Education for Sustainable Futures. When people ask you to reinvent, it means you need to think differently. You need to invent something that is not there. So the futures are not necessarily there, and they're not necessarily something that is tangible. However, it's something that we imagine. So when we start with the visioning process, we need to start by imagining how the community of 2050 would look like in 2050. And probably this is driven by the trends that we have. It's driven by the past, maybe even in the last 30 years, what had happened in the last 30 years. And what those last 30 years had, the impact that those last 30 years had in what is happening in the present. And that assists us to think about the next 30 years, 30 years or more. And as we are thinking and imagining this, we start thinking about the type of social, political, and economic activities that people would be engaged in order for us to start designing the higher education for that community. So also thinking about how higher education would look like in the reshaping, in the roadmap to 2050, they talk about access issues. We need to address access issues. We need to address lifelong learning approaches. As it is now, higher education is not doing very well in this space. We need to think about flexible learning pathways, at least in where I come from, in developing context. Learning pathways are not flexible. They are designed and developed for whoever that think that this is the right way to go. We need to think about the impact of technology on higher education. And most importantly, we need to think about whose knowledge is above other knowledges, and how do we make sure that the knowledge, the communal knowledge, the knowledge of the people on the ground, is it integrated into the curriculum that we are teaching. So we thought in this visioning process that we vision the common, our vision is based on common good. People working together and sharing responsibility as a collective for the benefit of the society, not for the benefit of the individual. We have seen that when education focuses on an individual, what happens? We bring together diverse knowledges to reaffirm that. And basically what we are saying is that we want to reaffirm the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights that makes higher education available, accessible, and adaptable. So we provide a vision where every member of society is empowered to develop their capacities and able to interact with others. And this is the common good vision that we aspire for. And in our visioning process, we also used social justice framework to ground that. Higher education has been criticized for being an unjust system that does not address the needs of all and sundry. So this is one thing that we need to address in higher education, and common good assists us to do this. So common good is the value and the vision that we want to, the image that we want to aspire for. And we know that if we use social justice as a frame that helps us to think about equality, what does equality mean? Equity. And we can tell in this picture that equity and equality are two different things. I come from South Africa, where about 20 years ago, and throughout our lives, we were fighting for equality. We got equality, but we are still not an equitable state. And we realize that equality and equity are two different things. The reality is that those that always had opportunities, they will continue to have opportunities, leaving behind those that never had opportunities. So the reality is that we need to be intentional, is the word, intentional, to becoming an equitable higher education that we aspire for. And we have, and I like Professor Zul always talk about the concepts that have been used in the past. This is not new things. The common good in the past, in South Africa, we have Ubuntu, those principles of Ubuntu that are grounded on common good, that are grounded on nurturing an environment that is socially just. I'm presenting this picture of men who come together to harvest. And these are in a village, men or women would come together in one house to harvest in that house. And then the following day, they'll go to the next house. And they all did that in a group, because for each household had to have food. Each household had to survive. So the survival and the safety of everybody belonged to everybody. So it is important that we look at the global common good. And the global common good also will help us to address issues such as climate change, to address other issues that are the political ills. If we start looking at ourselves as a collective rather than as individuals. And higher education has a very strong role to play in that because of its positioning in the society. So my recommendation, finally, is that we need to start having those images of the society we aspire for and develop them, and also develop capacity people's capacity to engage with futures work, and promote the culture of envisioning the futures of higher education. And unless we do that, we are going to be stuck with these images that we already have at this point. I'm going to leave it at that, colleagues, and thank you so much for this opportunity, and hope that we will visualize the future that we aspire for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that recap. I think it brings down memory lane again when we met in Barcelona discussing the same thing of how to move the future. I would like to start with a question. I think futures in many of our countries and universities is a new thing. You know, if I can remember when I became the Vice Chancellor of the university, the perception that I got is a future is determined by somebody else. We are given these at university and you work this out. There is no other path of recreating university in our own context. I think that's the biggest barrier for everybody. And plus now with the ranking thing, you know, if you don't follow one definition of university, you may not be able to rank as a world-class university and so on. How do you get away with the first idea that university is a flexible concept? It panders to the context and the values that you talk. And Africa certainly has a variety of values and cultural diversity that we are missing because we are now beginning to concentrate only on one idea of what the university. How do you overcome that mental barrier, so to speak?
Thanks, Prof. I don't know if we will be able to overcome that mental barrier, but I think we need not to follow what everybody is doing, and that's part of the problem. In Africa, for an example, we are still talking about decolonialization and all those things because we inherited a specific type of higher education and we sat with it. And that's why that very same higher education that we inherited is the one that is underdeveloping us. And now we are following on rankings, we are following on all these things that the world is talking about. But because we forget that education is about values. The starting point, if you educate any human being, you start with values. And we have to have the values that guides us as a higher education space. And I know it's a difficult space to operate in because we have regulators, we have governments, and governments are not looking at what we can get, the best way of what this higher education will be in the context, in our context. But we are looking at how we can compete with other people who are not even engaged in what we have. And as a result, we end up underdeveloping ourselves rather than contributing to a different higher education that we would like. That's why I'm coming up with the images. Let's have those images long enough to say this is where we want to be, because where we are right now is actually not addressing the developmental issues that we want. It's not addressing the sustainability issues that we want. We are going to be looking at sustainable development goals in 8 years' time, and we are far from getting those because of where we are right now. We have been following rather than being coming up with a vision that people may follow, if to, you know, for lack of a better way. What is higher education in Malaysia should look like? What is higher education in South Africa should look like, not what it has always been.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Will you be around, Prof, or you've got to leave too?
I've got to leave, unfortunately. I would really like, I'll be here just for a few minutes, but I've got to leave.
We just start to feel the heat of Barcelona now that three of you are around here coming now. So If there is no other questions, then let's get Dr. Pedro, yeah, who was the moderator in that session, but now you're speaking on the capacity of a resource person here. Dr. Pedro is director of International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is also institute under the UNESCO. The floor is yours, Prof.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity given to our institute representing UNESCO in this conversation. Thank you to the Vice Chancellor, with whom I spent really a very nice chat in Barcelona, as well as to the contributions made already by Professor Hopkins and Professor Mpine McCoy. I think that I'm going to add very few new ideas to what has already been said. Maybe my perspective is going to be slightly different. I'm going to share some slides, and I would like to start with just one question that I'm asking myself quite often. What would be the legacy of the World Higher Education 2022, the third World Higher Education? And I think that in policy terms, just to go beyond the philosophical discussions, I think that in policy terms, certainly I saw in Barcelona two basic principles reaffirmed in several discussions and panels. The first one, and I think that it is important that we recap on this, is that higher education is and should be considered to be a public good. This is very important because I think that having a clear principle in mind will help us to define the specific actions we have to pursue. I mean, when we say that higher education is a public good, as a matter of fact, we are also saying, and that's the second principle that was reaffirmed in Barcelona, is that the universal right to education does not exclude at all higher education. It's simply that over the past decades, we have been focusing a lot on enforcing the universal right to education, thinking about K-12 and increasingly also on preschool children, given the importance of the first years of education. But nevertheless, we shouldn't be confused about the fact that when we talk about the universal right to education, we include all forms of education, having a lifelong learning perspective in mind. So as a conclusion, I would say, if we are really convinced that higher education is a public good, and we are also pursuing the realization of the universal right to education, there is no other way than rethinking the way in which we are providing higher education nowadays. So I think that these two principles, I mean, are combined. Maybe one could say there are the two different coins of the two different sides of the same coin, but nevertheless, it is very important to have them in mind, because the whole process that we are starting now with this roadmap, which is still in a very drafting form, has to be inspired not only by, I would say, our willingness to see a new future for higher education, but also by some basic principles that follow the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also contribute to a better sustainable model of development. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing has already been commented by the predecessors. It's about, in a way, the agenda, what we call the roadmap. I think it's important to remind that there is a document available in English, French, and Spanish that is the draft for this roadmap that we would like to see it inspiring our conversations about higher education and our policy developments, both at national and institutional level for higher education in the next decade. This document is freely available from UNESCO's website. As it has already been said, is a living document as it stands now, and nourished by extensive research and wide consultation well before the conference. Let me just cite the background thematic papers prepared by the conference technical expert group, in which some of the preceding speakers participated. The report by the expert group on universities and the 2030 agenda that was launched during the conference, the Futures of Education report, as Professor Hopkins already mentioned, and a series of online conversations leading up to the conference, including the work of our own institute, as already mentioned by Professor McCall. We are guided by two time frames. The first one, of course, is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is approaching, I would say, too fast, probably, with its 17 goals. And secondly, the 2050 Horizon line of the Futures of Education initiative. So that's in a way, the starting point. Now, what are the principles on which this transformation that the proposed roadmap should be based on? Well, the starting point, once again, is that higher education is an integral part of the right to education, and it is so because it is a public good. So first, achieving greater inclusion and promoting diversity in higher education is a social justice imperative. What we call in our jargon at the United Nations SDGs, the SDG Sustainable Development Goal target 4.3 precisely calls for ensuring equal access to affordable technical, vocational, and higher education. And this is important because, you know, it's the only mention we have to higher education in the SDGs, and simply it speaks of the importance of equal access. Effective education and training systems where opportunities are equally distributed are the basis, we believe, for sustainable development and our window of opportunity for building more fair, peaceful, and democratic societies. Second, academic freedom. It is essential that we do as much as we can to protect the academic freedom of staff and students from any kind of political interference. This requires a high degree of institutional autonomy and self-governance, as well as an adequate balance between autonomy and, of course, public accountability. Third, inquiry, critical thinking, and creativity. These skills, competencies, I would say life attitudes, have to be connected to problem solving in every walk of life, to scientific literacy, to preparing students to find innovative solutions to address global challenges that we all share. Fourth, integrity and ethics. I think this speaks probably very clearly and loud to this particular university. Higher education institutions must place a strong emphasis on ethical values, and your university is already, I would say, at the vanguard of doing that. All graduates, according to UNESCO, should be prepared to become professionals or researchers who are champions of sustainability and citizens acting for social justice. Fifth, commitment to sustainability and social responsibility. Through training, research, and engagements, all higher education institutions can and must contribute actively to building a more sustainable world. And last but not least, cooperation for excellence, not competition. This runs from working in an interdisciplinary manner to pooling and openly sharing scientific resources. I think that these are the basic principles. And when we look at the classical three missions of universities and higher education institutions, it is very clear, at least from our perspective, that to reshape higher education, we need to look and maybe reinvent the three classical key missions. Traditionally, we refer to training, research, and social engagement. But now we believe that the time has come for us to talk about the content, the priorities in terms of content of each of these three missions. And here comes our proposal. First, educating citizens to address and navigate complexity is one of the main missions of universities today. Universities are one of the main contributors to building new, more global forms of citizenship. And this is very important, particularly nowadays, because remember, historically, UNESCO was created to promote the culture of peace. And only this global citizenship and the commitment of universities to building that kind of new forms of citizenship can really protect us from any risks of engaging in war, in conflict. I mean, we are living this already, between where you are and where I'm staying now in Ukraine, right? I mean, remember simply that UNESCO was created to promote the culture of peace. Second, we have heard, throughout the conference about the need for a more holistic and humanistic, as Professor Hopkins referred to, approaches to learning. Complexity requires knowledge to be produced through transdisciplinary approaches. So instead of talking about economy, history, science, let's talk about war. Let's talk about inequalities, right? Let's take a transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach that helps our students, our becoming professionals, to address problems and not simply disciplines. This transdisciplinary approach calls for connecting the sciences and the humanities, for sharing knowledge, promoting open science, which has been in UNESCO's agenda over the past decade, and integrating different knowledge systems, and has already been said, Professor McCoy already insisted on that, different epistemologies, different ways of knowing. And finally, all is about social engagement and ethical responsibility, which today means basically a commitment, a full commitment to sustainability. Now, the roadmap is also, I would say, very explicit about at least 6 major transitions that we would like to see happening between now and 2015. Let me just highlight briefly, let me highlight briefly the details of some of these major transitions. The first one is about transitioning from exclusion to inclusion. Higher education, as I already said, is part of the right to education and a public good with all the implications this carries. Second, we need to transition from a discipline-oriented towards a holistic approach that encompasses academic, professional, and citizenship dimensions, taking on board experiences learned during the pandemic. I think that it is very important that we really learn from this important crisis in which many countries are still involved. Third, from a methodology that focuses on silos to transdisciplinary. This encourages open dialogue between diverse perspectives to solve interconnected global challenges. From a terminal, incremental approach to a more lifelong learning oriented model, where we do not only serve the needs of youth, but of all citizens in our countries and in the planet. Fifth, from a hierarchical model, this principle of one size of university fits all within institutions towards a flexible diversity-based model, including regional approaches that favor flexibility and diversity. I think that this is already this has already been said by Professor McCoy, and it is extremely important. Let's take the example simply of the recognition of prior learning. And finally, from a perspective of providing content-based higher education to a perspective according to which the experience of higher education has to be life transforming. I think that that transformation is what anyone needs to feel when attending a public or private higher education institution. And in that, moving from the transmission of content to the next level, which of course has to count on mastering content, but to operate into the real world through the development of competencies. That's what makes our students really professionals and academics committed to the transformation of our societies and our model of development. And finally, let me simply restate that there is a clear timeline. And I think that at the beginning, the Vice Chancellor has requested us to suggest some practical avenues how to go about this. So the question here is, what is next? Well, I think the Barcelona conference was the beginning of a process framed by the 6 transitions I have already mentioned. And the roadmap has to be taken simply as a reference framework, no more, but no less than that. It is already the result of consultations that we have embarked on over the past 2 years, including our own institute. Now, this roadmap will be submitted to an open online consultation over the next months to take on board the contributions coming from anywhere in the world, either governments, institutions, actors such as students' organizations, teacher unions, and of course, networks of universities. It is important that by November, we can have a final version of the roadmap that will orient the SDG 4 Sustainable Development Goal number 4 implementation with the adoption of the SDG 4 Global Roadmap next November. We also propose to have what we call the Barcelona +5 a midterm higher education forum, possibly in Barcelona again, but maybe with a more decentralized across regions perspective, just fostering the review of how far we have gone with these transitions and maybe other transitions, because, you know, it's not only about, Professor McCoy has already said, it's not only about projecting the future, it's also about our own capacity to transform ourselves and to make sure that we follow the changing needs of our planet, so to say, and the people who are living in the planet, starting with the voices of our students. So that's it in a nutshell. I hope that as a recap, my presentation has been useful. And of course, we will be really happy to see that the university contributes to this development and refinement, I would say, of the roadmap. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pedro. That's very exciting, especially when you put up the transitions that from the old one to the new one, and that has always been the questions. I mean, how do we facilitate that kind of transitions? We know what needs to be done, but we're always being dragged down back to the old behavior or old system because of ranking, because of governance, bureaucracy, and etc. So is there anything that you can share, that something that is happening back in Latin America? How do we facilitate these transitions?
Yeah. I think that if you look at what has been happening over the past 2 years because of the pandemic in the higher education landscape, you will agree with me that we all wanted to use these efforts that we have all put on the digital transformation of our provision to become integral part of the future provision of higher education. Okay, that's an example of how things could be done, because as far as I know, many universities set up at the very beginning of the crisis committees and internal reflection groups involving different actors about the implications of the so much needed digital transformation. For many universities, the equipment, the connectivity was already there, but they were missing, for instance, the skills and competencies, not only on the side of teachers, but also on the side of students. So they decided to be very fast and put forward a kind of a strategic plan to foster that digital transformation. Now, it is too early, I would say, to say whether those plans have been successful in really changing the landscape of the provision of higher education, certainly. But how, if the question is how we can go one step further and make sure that all these transitions, start happening, I would say start by creating your own strategic plan that really answers the question how we would like our institution to be in the upcoming 10 years, so to say, or between now and 2050, just to adopt the time frame set by the roadmap. And then let's take the example of your own context and see which one of these transitions that UNESCO is proposing at the global level really makes sense for you and can help you to strive to promote higher education with the highest quality to your students, and also to promote equity in this perspective of considering higher education a public good and, of course, part of the universal right to education. So without a specific plan, and with that I would like to end my contribution, without a specific plan, nothing is going to happen. Others will tell us what to do if we don't have our own strategy. Thank you.
Francis, thank you so much. I got two questions, and this perhaps go back to Barcelona sort of discussion. I remember in the panel that we were in, Kerry made a statement, a rather strong one, by saying that this MBA needs to be phased out because they are the one that's pushing education to such a way that it becomes a private good rather than a public good. The way you put it. In my part of the world, in Malaysia, certainly I think private education is taking a huge sort of role in pushing or at least shaping also what a higher education will be like. I tend to share what Kerry is saying. And in other words, if you talk about influence of direction of higher education, at least in Global South, from my point of view, tend to be a private good rather than a public good. And private good is made in such a way that there's high demand, very elitist, very somehow or rather focusing only to segments of population rather than the total population. How do you deal with this in the context of policy, particularly UNESCO and so on? The second one, I think my own discussion with you, when I talk at the end of the day that we need to remodel higher education. And given your sixth transition, do you see this remodeling is something that we can do, or do we need to just stick on the old model just by working on the sixth transition that you were proposing? Can I have your reaction on this too? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my Chancellor. I think I would need probably a full day of conversations with you just to clarify our own position when it comes to that. But certainly, I think that when it comes to your first question about the fact that without the provision of private, so to say, institutions, it would be impossible to cover the exploding demand that has existed not only in your region, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, the Arab countries, and of course, Latin America. Now, I think that we have to distinguish here two things. One is that for UNESCO, and I think that we can say for United Nations, education is a public good. There is no question about that, which is very different from saying whether to provide access to a public good, you need to be a publicly funded institution, or whether a private institution can also contribute to the provision of that public good. I think that this is probably, it's not going to solve your question, but I think that that when it comes to UNESCO's perspective, we clearly we see already this happening in so many regions of the world, maybe with the exception of Europe, that without private providers, the exploding demand of higher education wouldn't find the adequate response. So it's really a lot of ingenuity to think that we can cancel simply private providers. But that is different from saying that countries need to have regulations preventing higher education to be commodified. And that is, I mean, we are not against the existence of private providers of higher education that may have, their own perspectives, but rather we are against the marketization of higher education. We don't understand from the perspective of UNESCO how anyone can make profit out of providing any kind of education. So I think that that's certainly a clear frontier between being you a private or a public university. It doesn't matter whether you consider this to be a public good or simply a private good for which you can ask a fee and get benefits out of that. So that's the capitalist model, so to say, and we don't see this really applying to the access to a public good such as education. That's one thing. You also mentioned the MBAs. Once again, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I would be probably in support of that idea, because the fact is that our current economic models depend very much on the existence, of companies that are competitive, that require, highly skilled people, and no matter if public universities decide not to provide an MBA, others will do it. So my view is that unless we change dramatically our model of, economic production, for the time being, I mean, if a public university does not provide an MBA, then leaves, all the road for other private providers. So rather than, saying no, they should disappear, I would say no. Let's do that from the perspective of what the public university can do and what the added value of this public perspective could be. That's the first thing. And then when it comes to the to your second question, I think that it is really quite difficult to respond, Vice Chancellor. And unfortunately, I think I miss probably the details about providing you with the with an appropriate response. I would prefer, if you don't mind, that we continue this conversation, in another opportunity with more time, certainly, and with a more knowledgeable perspective. I've never been to Malaysia, so unfortunately, I'm not asking to come, right? No, don't take. I would be very pleased, but it's not my role, right? But I think that to answer properly your question, someone has to really be knowledgeable about the context in which you operate. So I prefer to be taken as an ignorant person, humbly, rather than providing a universal response that won't be of any help. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You're welcome to Malaysia. We'll make sure that you'll come sooner. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Maybe we will take the questions to Charles, who I was informed that is still glued to the sessions. But I'm not sure whether he will answering consciously or while he's driving. Charles, if you're still around, especially on the model of the remodeling, and then maybe you can lead to the RCE thing.
Yeah. Well, regarding the MBA, I don't think that they should be abolished. I mean, what is taught is the important thing. I think that's where like Professor Pedro, I think that it's the kind of thing we need to think a little bit more about, and I'd love to read the research that led to that comment, and so it would be from a more informed thing. But basically, I don't like censoring things simply on a broad line. I know we have at our university, we have an international MBA that ranks very, very high in the world, within the top 5, but from a sustainability perspective. and they contribute a great deal of pretty piercing insights, you know, even addressing just how real is a circular economy. You know, can we really continue a perpetual motion without a loss of materials and, you know, that sort of thing. So I think it's important in moving forward with the concept itself of sustainable development that we have the dissenters and that we have the people who do the questioning. It's an important part of higher education to do a critical analysis and bring forward these conundrums for us to discuss. I'll leave it at that point.
Yeah. Thanks, Charles. But if you can comment a bit, I mean, being in RCE circle for the almost 15, 20 years already. Before we ask Mickey for a comment as well, the remodeling of university. I mean, a new model of university that we thought that pushing universities to work closely with community. If you can comment from the perspective on RCE.
Mm-hmm. I think both speakers, I was fascinated, the idea of the pot, you know, the three-legged, I thought we were going down the road of the three-legged stool of social, environmental, and economic. But when she added about teaching, research, and community service and so on. Yeah, I think at the heart of it is this whole idea of I'm not sure whether every university has to do these three things equally, or whether consortiums of universities and institutions of higher education specialize, but do so in a consortium. You know, because we do have some that are really good more in the research, and we do have some that are really excellent teaching institutions where the researchers themselves, if they try to do teaching, it just doesn't work out. So this is the kind of thing that I think we need to talk about in as we address the roadmap. As we're moving forward, how do we achieve the equity? How do we achieve excellence? How do we serve humanity? How do we serve our own community? And what is really the best way of doing that? And how do we get a place at the table where we are in control of our own transformation? Reason I couldn't go back to bed was simply the other speakers were far too interesting. These are big questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. Mickey, if you're around, do you have anything to add and maybe explain a bit, because maybe Dr. Pedro is not that familiar with the RCE concept. If you are still in, Mickey, just share some highlights of the latest updates on this RCE, if you're still around.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you very much for the interesting presentations from the previous speakers. So RCE is a network at the local level to transform sustainability vision into local actions. And that is a multi-stakeholder network involving different stakeholders, including higher educations, but also formal, like elementary school to higher education, but also non-formal and informal education institutions. And today the focus was how to transform higher education, and there was some keywords like transdisciplinary, holistic, lifelong learning, and flexibility and diversity. And I thought that kind of important elements were already involved in the RC concept. And there are currently about 180 RCs around, including RCE Greater Gombak, which your university is a host. And the role of higher education is very important in RCE because which the universities will provide knowledge, but in RCE, higher education work together closely with the local community, and all the higher education staff or lecturers and students were addressing the real issue at the local level. So I think the concept as well as the practice of RCEs are provide very good example to transform higher education. So that was my thoughts from today's webinar. So thank you so much. And as Professor Zul said, RC Greater Gombak will host the Asia Pacific regional meeting, and it will provide a very good opportunity to learn from each other and also deliver a message beyond the RC network. So thank you very much for your cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mickey. It's interesting to hear those updates. We recall that when we started 2007, just correct me if I'm wrong, we were like only 7 of us, only 7 of us, and now there are like 202, right?
185.
185, right? So all over the world, that includes Latin America. So we thought that this is quite interesting transformations in order to go towards that kind of higher education that we are looking forward to. Tan Sri, you want somehow bring?
I just want to elaborate on the remodeling, because the remodeling from Malaysian point of view has something to do with financing at the same time. So, for example, if we don't remodel the university now, the way we see it, community engagement perhaps is not a big agenda of the university, and we keep on subsidizing research. Research in a different way. I was just reading the latest publication by a group of people from the University of Cambridge that are now challenging the whole idea of just publishing in a journal without any impact on the ground. I think it's almost 17 chapters, I think, that everybody is criticizing where is the human dimension and so on. I mean, once University of Cambridge starts to question this kind of a model, then our policy makers, the government, begin to listen, because somehow or other it has to start in the north. People in the south may shout this is not the way to do it, but nobody will take care of what we say until somebody in the north, perhaps European countries most probably make that kind of a signal, then things begin to shift. So my thinking is, when we talk about remodeling, if you want to talk about community engagement in a serious way, then there must be equivalent funding. If there's no equivalent funding and the funding is still on very much industrial sort of employability and research of that dimension, then we will never be able to put a strong emphasis on the SDG, as it were, or if there is, only on very selected goals rather than the communal goal as such. So the push, and I remember, Chuck, maybe you can also help me, when Professor Van Ginkel talked about RCE, at one point, we also talk about the movement from regional centers of expertise to regional clusters of expertise. In other words, we begin to organize a team on a thematic basis, so we have got expertise over the world that can exchange on expertise on a theme. It could be water, it could be air, it could be any of the 17 SDG. And finally, this is a dream that needs to be realized, that we have got this global repository that everybody can access. And then I think it's a real common good. in that particular sense of the word. You know, everybody can access this global repository without copyright. It's almost open access and stuff like that. That's a dream to be realized. But until we remodel this university in that direction, then I think we're stuck with this very siloed model that is funded and also recognized for that. You know, now Malaysia, the bad news is the government is providing more funds for another university to be ranked in the top 50. You know, so in other words, the shift is still not there, and this university is fighting very hard to make sure that there is a shift. And that's where the common university model that we talked about on the sideline at Barcelona is something that we want to try and push. Thanks.
Yeah, I see there are several people online. Yeah, if anyone would chip in any ideas, how do we mainstream this kind of like working with the community, and we are already pushing for this, and looks like Barcelona is really recognizing the need for this community engagement and etc. And Prof. Mpine with the three-legged thing is what it's talking about, and also Dr. Pedro is also highlighting the principles, which the essence are all about working with the community and for the community. But like what Tan Sri Zul said, that if ranking are still the game in town, then we will still have the same challenge that we need to do something about it. Yeah. Anyone would like to chip in? I saw our UNGS and also CCUB strong support. Prof. Zaleha, Dr. Razina. Anyone would like to chip in? Any suggestions from online?
I saw Irina. Irina may want to say something because she does a lot of work on community engagement at the same time. Are you still there, Irina? No.
No. Irina, you want to recall your
Yeah.
Okay, please.
Okay.
Yeah, just open the mic. Sorry. Thank you very much. It's a very great session, study session, since not all of us have a chance to going to Barcelona, and sharing the output from Barcelona is really enlightening our current effort at the ground. Yeah. I could say that the model currently that we work with Okayama City Hall, and as part of an effort to re-evaluate the current Okayama model on a sustainable society by using ESD approach. And then we found that the model, by using the quintuple helix, we innovate the model, and then the Okayama model shows that the government effort in establishing the social innovation environment by having the community learning center throughout the Japan since after the World War II, I think 1940s, on the establishment of the Social Education Act, is really provide a solid foundation for it's not only the Okayama, but the whole Japanese society. I would say that I surprised actually, because I thought Japanese is very techno society, very high-tech society. But indeed, when it comes to this the finding, and I think we went there with Dr. Zainal in 2019. Even we went to the community learning center. Is really actually the one that we need to look into, on how the transformation on the sustainable society is not coming from the university itself, but it's coming from the community. But of course, the intervention by provide the right policy for establishing the social innovation is not only the environment, but the social aspect that is really enlightening. And then this is also supported by the local government massively throughout the Japan. And another thing, the second point is the framework of the RCE. I think the one that we promote in Insan Sejahtera, and then we keep doing it, I think, in every semester in type program. So this is also another a factor that helps Okayama and also the Japanese transform into a sustainable society. So I think that's all from me. Thank you, Tan Sri and Zainal.
Thank you, Irina.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Thank you, Irina. I think when we were there 2019, Datuk Wan was there too. I remember his remarks is like maybe it was quite the first time to see how the universities and the city hall really working together, reflecting what Irina was saying, that it's not just university people getting excited with the community, but the city hall working very closely with the university. I noticed that Catherine is still around, and she may have quite interesting experience that you have shared with Faris before, and whatever that you shared before, that now seeing it as a student. I mean, you've been working with UNESCO for a long time, and in fact, your thesis, PhD thesis is about ESD. But I guess on the ground and reality, is university really serious about transforming itself so that it can transform the students?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to chip in my perspective as well. As I'm going through the interesting experience of growing up in Europe and going through the education system in Germany, having also studied in the United States and now working for a university in Canada. So I'm going full circle once around, and now I'm a PhD student in Malaysia. And even the fact that I'm probably I'm 40, so I'm the category of a mature student, even having the courage and going back to university and experiencing the university as an open place for people from all walks of life, and for returning students is a great experience that I can right now actually make at Iium. But the role of universities to be open and receive students back at the point in time when they are ready to return to education, and also encouraging the values of making the sacrifice. And at my mid-career stage, I'm being asked, why are you doing this? Why are you taking the break in a career to return to education, to take the time and do it in a way that might be individually engaging and bring you forward as a person, but you're taking a pay cut, you're taking cuts and all these economically seen ways, encouraging that perspective, the value of that, and the way universities can help to make sense out of this world out there. I think as one of the points that I would find particularly important, as not only studying your field, but helping to make sense out of the world around us in those themes and those issues that go beyond our own discipline, and encourage the engagement with what is happening at the UN level. And I think we at York are starting with that, and at IIUM this is this for you, it's almost a tradition now to offer these opportunities to learn about what is happening at the UN level and what does this mean for us, and include the student voice. I would have hoped today to even have a student speaker and see how a student speaker makes sense out of these documents that are being provided, and how the Malaysian student perspective would lead and would interpret what has been written in Barcelona. So maybe we can do that in one of our future consultations. Anyways, thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Catherine. You are representing the students. You're not? Okay, all right. Okay. Anyone else? Prof. Haris, you want to say some general, response to it?
Just, reflecting on the documents and as well as the speakers, I would say that two things, I think, my final comments. Number one is the issue of, I think Prof. Pedro mentioned this, about now most countries treat education as an industry. I think that is the main the main root cause of everything, because they treat the education as an industry, it's an economic. So because of that, then they lose all the sense of social responsibility, community. I guess this is one of the big battle that we have to go back and really see. I mean, how can we bring back the original purpose of the university, where university is a place to prepare the future leaders with good values, and also how to look at the real problems, current and the future. I think that is number one on this perspective of I mean, looking forward for the education. Number two, talking about reimagining of the university, I guess, like for example, the issue of technology. I'm very happy that one of the things under the 6 items is technology. I mean, talking about how technology and education. And then based on our experience, let's see about artificial intelligence. It was not there 5-6 years ago, but suddenly this new creature coming in, and now everybody is struggling. And I'm very sure also in the next few years also there will be new technologies coming up. So that's why I think this framework of what really is the purpose and the objectives of the education is very important, so that when new technologies come out, it will not disrupt the basic fundamental of education. If I think the framework, the objectives is well grounded in terms of the humanistic, holistic values, then whatever technology comes, it will survive. Otherwise, I think we are just dancing with the new tunes, and then at the end of the day, I guess we will lose our original and the fundamental purpose of education. Thank you.
Prof, I don't know. I'm a bit excited about this AI thing. What we see on the ground is that, yes, we do see the need to address kind of ethical issues in AI, but realities in the class, someone else is teaching about AI, someone else is teaching about ethics of AI, and that will create for the same problem, same cycle of thing that is very disconnected, and at the end they're not meeting. So how do we put this thing together as long as there's still 2 different classes, 2 different lecturers struggling to put it together? Well, I mean, it takes away the whole spirit of something that need to be embedded and teach integratively rather than separately. But that's what happened.
I guess that's the challenge. I mean, I guess one of the main challenge in the academia is very dynamic. You have to respond very fast, and I fully. I mean, I guess that's why when I said that, looking at the Barcelona documents and then other document that was presented by Charles before, is quite solid. I mean, it's quite comprehensive. But then how can when these new elements come in, for example, I mean, to address your issue is integration is there. The word integration is there. So I think the framework already mentioned integration, interdisciplinary, meaning that, I mean, you cannot work in silo. I mean, people in AI must also be well-versed in values, ethics. I mean, I guess the next important word is responsible. I mean, the responsibility must come in. I mean, whenever that this new technology come in, what is the responsibility? How we can use the technology responsibly? You know, that sort of thing. So I guess that is a challenge. And again, like some of the speakers mentioned, this is change. I mean, the one thing that is constant is change. I mean, we have to, keep changing.
I was informed, Liana, raise your hand, or is that incidentally, or I think the question is right for you to respond to?
I did raise my hand.
Okay, thank you. Go on.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, this is where we just came back from Pernis, right? And one of the things that I learned there was that the children, basically missed out 2 years of education because of the pandemic. We are talking about the disadvantaged children, the children who really needed education. They didn't go to school. Obviously not physically, they couldn't, but they didn't go to school online because they didn't have the gadget. And then also they didn't have access to the internet, even if somebody were to give them a gadget. Okay. And then now that the pandemic is over, people are going back to school. They're not interested in going to school. So what does it have to do with the university here? Well, I'm thinking that we, as a university, we haven't been going down that part yet. We're doing community engagement, community transformation, but perhaps where we have, because when I was talking to the Raja Pamuda, I was saying that perhaps one of the things that we needed to do is, instead of getting the children to school, make the school go to them, because of the things that are going on in their lives. So perhaps this is also something that the university can do. I'm also, this is just me thinking aloud, thinking that what are we also doing as a university? Because when we talk about these children, offhand, I can say that offhand, they're probably not going to be coming to IIUM. Why? Because we only want, quote unquote, the best students in. And what do we mean by the best? We mean the best academically, who are doing well, very, very well, scoring all these A's. And if you say, but this is not what we are doing, I'll say we all sit in the Senate, we have all the senators here, and we know that when we talk about admission requirement, all the faculties, all the programs want pretty much very, very high level, of achievement at the SPM or A levels before the students can come in. So there's a bit of a mismatch in terms of, what we say we want to do and what we're actually doing. This is not about this is not about criticizing the university. This is, to me, is about us, IIUM and also other universities, on the one hand, we're talking about all these ideals, and on another hand, there are things that we could probably really go in and do, and either on the ground or also on our sites systemically, but we're probably not doing that because it's perhaps for the academics, it's not convenient to them. It doesn't help them go forward professionally in terms of promotion wise. Okay, sensitive issues there, not going there. But because it cannot be just the university management wanting to do this. The change has to come from top to bottom, from bottom to top. It has to be all across for the university to really be a transformative agent. And I'm still trying to figure out how are we actually going to help to get everyone in the university to get on this bandwagon. And I hope these are things that we're going to be able to have dialogues. No, there's no solution here. I'm just giving out more things for us to keep on the table so that we can start really discussing this and have some concrete action taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Lihana. Tan Sri, you want to respond? Or no? Okay. You're talking about the bandwagon. I think there is a wagon that we're pushing for now. Is the WIT wagon? Is the whole institution transformation wagon that everyone get to be in. And yeah, like what Prof. Faris said, this is the challenge.
Or maybe picking people up, or people going on the bandwagon. Yeah. It's been years. It's been 2 years now.
Yeah, true. But let's keep like you said, rightly said, that to keep the discussions, the discourse ongoing, but deeper level rather than just, we talk about it and then move on without really ensuring that the root cause is being addressed. Yeah? We almost time, but if Dr. Pedro is still around and or Charles would like to say any remarks before. before we close the sessions? Prof. Pedro, you still around? Yeah. You would like to say any last words?
I was about to write a message just to say goodbye, because unfortunately time flies and I have to move to my next commitment. So I wanted to first of all express my gratitude to Professor Hopkins, because I think that he has been an example of endurance. Just
You're right.
with the discussions, but I really appreciate it. I really appreciated at the end of the session these exchanges about the importance of flexibility, the importance of having a commitment to community development, and I think that this is certainly something that needs to be probably better featured in the roadmap. I think that there is very little about that, and really would like to see that from your university you make a contribution, just helping us to really reframe that particular aspect, which I think is really important. I think that the roadmap is very good, but has, I would say, a global perspective, and loses the details, the nuances of the importance of what universities do, particularly for the communities they are serving, whether they are vulnerable or not, but certainly that's the first mission they should fulfill. So thank you very much, and once again, my full gratitude to all of you, wishing very much that this is the beginning of something rather than the end of a process. Thank you very much, and congratulations for this. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Pedro. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Yeah. Charles, you have any
great.
words for?
Well, thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I look forward to this as an ongoing discussion. I've really intrigued with the whole idea of building the community engagement. I love Dr. Pedro's reinventing of the three classical missions, and because that of the university, he talked about global citizens, and then he talked about social engagement and sort of ethical responsibility enveloped into sustainable development. And then he talked about open science and that sort of sharing knowledge with the community, knowledge flowing back and forth and so on. So I'm very, very inspired with that. I don't think we will instantly get rid of research, teaching, and community service, but fleshing them out in this new context, I think makes a great deal of sense. But at any rate, thank you so much for the opportunity of taking part in this, and I look forward to ongoing discussions in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah. Second wish of good night, or you still have time to sleep?
Yeah,
so good morning already.
Would have been so easy to go back to bed if the other speakers hadn't been so engaging.
We'll see you in July. We'll see you in July in Malaysia, Jack.
Right. Good night.
Good night. Good night. Good night. Tan Sri, if you have any closing remarks, yeah.
Well, the closing remark is simple. Thank you very much. I think all the speakers have done excellently well, including Mickey and the rest of us here. So I hope this will inspire us to look forward. There are still more work to be done. I think the directions are quite clear, and I also resemble some of the things that we do, particularly in the context of the 6th transition that Pedro was talking about. Very much the community kind of, indicators, except if we've got 5, you've got 6. So we can take a look at that. So thank you, everybody. It's lucky that it's not 5 o'clock in the morning. But anyway, thank you very much. I need to go to Gambang now, inshallah. So, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you everyone online. Let's end our session with tasbih kafarah and surah al-asr. Subhanallah.